Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited about my guest today, as he has written a tremendous new book revealing how American policymakers have weaponized the world economy. Eddie, I'm so glad you could join us today. Please tell us your name, the title of your book, and a little bit more about your background.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Pavan, for having me on your podcast. My name is Eddie Fishman. My book is called Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. And it came out at the end of February of this year, so just a few months ago. And my background really in some ways is very much tied to the news today. It starts when I finished college in 2011 and then joining the Treasury Department with a goal of really trying to work on an economic pressure campaign to stop Iran's nuclear program. And that led me initially, like I said, to the Treasury Department, eventually to the State Department, where I worked on the oil sanctions against Iran that led to the nuclear deal, and then working on the Russia sanctions after Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and annexation of Crimea. And really, since leaving government, I've spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what I call the age of economic warfare, where sanctions, tariffs, export controls have become the primary way that great powers compete with one another. So today I teach at Columbia University. I teach a class on economic statecraft, and I've spent a lot of my time over the last few years writing the book Chokepoints.
Eddie, let's begin with our first question. Your book highlights how the US government utilizes its position to wage economic war against its adversaries. Can you give us a high-level overview of the kind of weapons that policymakers can utilize and why they may prefer these tools over military ones?
Sure. So the most important tool that the United States has weaponized is what's called sanctions. And sanctions critically leverage America's control over the global financial system and the dollar's really unparalleled role in global finance. Previously, if you go back to the 1990s, which was kind of the eve of what I call the age of economic warfare, sanctions existed, right? Economic warfare has been as old as history. But even in the 1990s, when the UN imposed sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq and tried to stop Iraq from selling oil on the global marketplace, they did that not through trying to weaponize the financial system, but really by parking ships outside of Iraqi ports and inspecting oil cargoes coming in and out of Iraq effectively 24/7 from 1990 all the way up till the second bigger US invasion of Iraq in 2003. What changed really and what enabled the use of more modern economic weapons is hyperglobalization. In the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, when countries like Russia and China enter the global financial system, enter transnational supply chains, you have the creation of these choke points, like the dollar-based system, where one country has asymmetric power that it can use against rivals. So today, instead of having to deploy a naval blockade of a foreign country to reduce its oil revenues, you can literally, as a US president, just sign a document in the Oval Office to impose financial sanctions and block countries from paying dollars for that country's oil. So a big reason why the US has used financial sanctions so much over the last 25 years is because the threshold for deploying them has gone significantly down. Now all you need is the president signing a document in the Oval Office, whereas the impact has gone up because of this hyperglobalization. So that is really what has created this incentive for the US to use sanctions so aggressively. I'd note there are other weapons of economic warfare that the US and other countries use. Export controls is an important one. The US has used its primary position in the semiconductor value chain to impose export controls on China and Russia in recent years. And then, of course, even in just the last few months, China has used its dominance of the rare earth minerals that it controls to impose economic pain on the United States. And so it's not just the US who controls these choke points. Other countries have some of them, but the dollar has been the most important one for the last 25 years.
Eddie, we got about a minute more for this question. Can you talk a little bit more about why the American public and American policymakers would rather use this rather than military means?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of it is the legacy of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, after those wars really became quagmires in the mid-aughts, the American people and the American political spectrum really lost faith in the use of military force as a tool of statecraft on both sides of the aisle. Really, it has been neither Democratic nor Republican presidents who've been wanting to fight additional wars. And so economic warfare has looked appealing by comparison. I think the other important point to note is that in the last decade or two, American adversaries have started to become other great powers like China and Russia, who have nuclear weapons, and the US really doesn't want to fight wars against other nuclear armed adversaries. And so economic warfare has been much more appealing relative to military force.
Eddie, let's move on to our second question. And you brought it up a little bit in your response to the first one, but I really want to dive deep into it. Your book begins with a necessary look back to the consolidation of American dominance following the end of the Cold War. How did leaders in Washington attempt to shape the global order in their favor in the 1990s and 2000s?
Well, it's a big question. The U.S. did a lot to try, is always trying to shape the global order in their favor. I mean, in the 1990s, U.S. officials had really an unprecedented opportunity, right? Because this is pretty rare historically, where a rival superpower just kind of commits suicide, which is what happened, right? The Soviet Union peacefully dissolved. This country that the U.S. had been at sort of at loggerheads with for decades, just decided to dissolve. Really, initially, what the US did to try to shape the post Cold War order in its favor was to take the order that it had built amongst other advanced industrial democracies, amongst the Europeans, amongst countries like Japan, and to expand it to the rest of the world. So, what that looked like was bringing countries like China and Russia into organizations like the WTO, encouraging American banks to start lending to these countries who were emerging from communism, and to China, which wasn't emerging from communism but was rapidly sort of moving in the capitalist direction. And the theory of the case at the time in the 1990s was that as these countries became more deeply ingrained in the global economy, they would become more like the United States. They would ultimately become more like liberal democracies, and at the very least, their foreign policy interests would be aligned with the United States. I think in the early 2000s, some of these sort of hopes and premises started looking a lot shakier than they did in the 1990s. At first, Putin, with his rise to power in Russia, starts rebuilding Russia's military capacity. And then, of course, in 2008, Russia launches an invasion of Georgia and winds up recognizing two breakaway regions there. And that was really a shock to the system, because this was, Russia that was invading one of the other former post-Soviet states. And then, of course, throughout this time as well, China starts building up its military. And then critically in the early 2010s, when Xi Jinping comes in, the tension with the United States and the West becomes much more acute. China starts militarizing islands in the South China Sea, deploying pressure on other neighboring states. They impose, I think, the first major act of Chinese economic warfare in modern times was against Japan in 2010, when they cut off rare earth minerals to Japan. And so basically, over the course of this period, both China and Russia, instead of evolving in the direction that the US hoped, wind up taking the power that they're deriving from integration into the global economy and using it basically to advance their own interests. And so what we have today, in large part, is we have a global economy that's still designed, that's still premised on this notion in the 1990s that we should bring these countries into the international system, but they're challenging it from within. And so I think one way to view the rise of restrictive economic measures like sanctions and export controls and tariffs is that it's a kind of an attempt to retrofit the global economy to account for the fact that neither China nor Russia really can be expected to evolve in a liberal democratic direction anymore.
Final minute with this question. For American leaders during this time, as they're shaping the global order, it was a bipartisan consensus, right? You write about this in the book.
Definitely, yeah, and it's a bipartisan consensus. And by the way, I think it was worth trying. Like even though it didn't work in retrospect, even though neither China nor Russia evolved in the way that American officials hoped, I think it was a unique historical opportunity to try to build and foster a more peaceful, liberal world. So I don't think it was wrong for policymakers in the 1990s to try to integrate China and Russia. I think in retrospect, the bigger error was not changing course sooner, when it became quite clear that neither country was evolving in the direction that American officials hoped.
Eddie, let's move on to our third question. Rather than soldiers and generals, you showcase how the protagonists of this new style of geopolitical competition are bankers, lawyers, and diplomats. Who are they? And walk us through the mindset of these individuals as they grapple with the choices that they made.
Yeah, look, and there's so many of them, so it's hard for me to go through all of them. But I'll just spotlight one because I think he's a really critical figure in this history and a very important character in my book, Chokepoints. And his name is Stuart Levy. Stuart is a lawyer. He's actually currently the chief legal officer of Oracle, the technology company. But when he enters the narrative of Chokepoints and when he enters this story, he's a lawyer, more junior lawyer at the Justice Department in his late 30s. And he becomes important because in 2004, really to try to combat the war on terror and try to cut off terrorist financing to groups like Al Qaeda, the Bush administration creates a new division in the Treasury Department called the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And Stuart Levy is pulled over from the Justice Department to become the first head of this organization. Levy's background really isn't in national security. He's never served in the military. He really is a lawyer. And at the time, um, while he's focused on really combating terrorist financing, was really when Iran's nuclear program comes to the fore as a foreign policy and national security problem that the United States must confront, because Iran was actually developing a real uranium enrichment program at home. The US had just invaded Iraq to try to get rid of their weapons of mass destruction. Those proved not to exist. But Iran was actually developing a nuclear program. And there were fears that if Iran was allowed to have industrial scale nuclear enrichment, they could either build a nuclear weapon themselves and challenge neighbors, or just take the fissile material that they're producing and transfer it to one of their terrorist proxies like Hamas or Hezbollah, and you could have a nuclear 9/11 on your hands. And so the Bush administration was grappling what to do with this. And Bush himself, the president, really didn't have much faith that sanctions had a role to play. The reason was that the US had had an embargo on Iran since the 1990s. There was very little trade at all between the US and Iran. And then there was no hope that you could get the UN to support sanctions against Iran. So it was kind of seen that, we had done as much as we could as a country domestically, and because the rest of the international community didn't share our concerns, we would never really be able to have aggressive sanctions against Iran. Levy, when he sort of heard Bush's complaints that sanctions would never work against Iran, viewed this really as almost like a personal challenge. And there was one morning actually when he's on a trip to Bahrain in 2005, flipping through the Financial Times, when he reads an article about a Swiss bank that has cut ties with Iran of its own volition. And there's sort of a light bulb moment that Levy has where he realizes, and part of this is because of his background as a lawyer, that banks around the world and other companies around the world make their own risk-based decisions about what types of countries they feel comfortable transacting with. And maybe the US government could actually go persuade banks around the world that it's not in their risk-based interest to do business with Iran, that they may not have to get support from the British government or the German government or the Chinese government, but if they can persuade banks in places like the UK and Germany and China to cut ties with Iran, then the effect would be the same. And so that really is what inaugurates this new form of economic warfare where the US is weaponizing choke points, going after the financial system directly, going and talking to bankers, trying to persuade them to cut ties with Iran. And when that fails, threatening to cut them off from the US dollar if they don't comply with American wishes.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit more about the motivations for these individuals for our final 2 minutes. And you write about it in the book. They were wanting to fight authoritarianism. They wanted to minimize casualties amongst American citizens. What were they thinking, these economic warriors?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think many of them really did have this belief that if they could create enough pressure on Iran, that they could potentially get a peaceful resolution to the nuclear program. And the reason this is such a pertinent conversation today is, in some ways, the strikes that Israel and the United States now have launched against Iran in the last few weeks mark the end of that campaign, right? I mean, for 20 years, really from Stuart Levy having that epiphany in Bahrain in 2005 to 2025, the goal of the United States was to use economic pressure to try to get Iran to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons program. And so I think many of the people involved viewed that as, in some ways, a noble calling. It was a non-military way to try to advance American objectives. And I think in some ways it's tragic today and a sign of the shortcomings of the policy that we are in the middle of hostilities with Iran.
Eddie, let's move on to our fourth question. The book reveals how leaders in Washington are able to put pressure on a number of choke points to coerce, punish, and steer its rivals in a direction that benefits America. Can you describe the role of the private sector as the leaders of the companies affected grapple with new legislation and the executive orders?
The private sector is absolutely critical. And this sort of goes back to what I just talked about with respect to Stuart Levy and his realization that banks have their own risk-based decisions about which types of countries they want to transact with. You know, what is the global economy? The global economy is just the sum total of the decisions of private actors, of banks, of companies, of executives, of buyers, of consumers. That is what comprises the actual global economy. So what sanctions do is they affect that, and they affect the decision making. A really important point, though, is that in order to affect the decision making of big banks or energy companies, there has to be a consequence if they don't comply with US sanctions policy. And if the penalties are small, a banker or an oil CEO may view sanctions violations as a cost of doing business. Something like, I live in New York City. Sometimes I park illegally and get a parking ticket, and it's okay because it's, it made it more convenient for me, to get to my destination. And that doesn't necessarily deter me from doing it again because it's, not particularly expensive. If that is the cost of violating sanctions, banks are not going to change their calculus. So a really important part of this story is that in the late aughts and through the 2010s, the US starts imposing a series of escalating fines on banks around the world for sanctions violations. Standard Chartered and HSBC, the British banks, are both fined billions of dollars and have their US banking license threatened if they don't comply with American sanctions. BNP Paribas, one of the biggest banks in Europe, it's a French bank, is fined $9 billion in 2014 for a variety of sanctions violations. It wipes out the bank's entire profit for the year. And in the course of these big fines, the banks realize that this is existential for them. If they don't comply with American sanctions, they may go out of business. And so they hire massive teams of compliance officers. Many of them have thousands of people working on sanctions compliance, as well as, spending, millions and millions of dollars on software to help them comply with sanctions. And so what basically happens over the course of the story I tell in Chokepoints is the financial sector is conscripted to be the frontline infantry in American economic warfare. And I think an important point to make is that it really is the US that is seen as the key player when banks and companies are concerned, even if you're a European bank or company. And it's because it's the US has been exacting all these fines, right? BNP Paribas is a French bank. They're fined $9 billion by the Justice Department in the US. And so that's why sanctions that are initiated by, Canada or the EU or Japan are frankly not taken as seriously by the private sector because there's not the same track record of aggressive enforcement.
So American policymakers know that the targets are not necessarily the rivals or adversaries themselves. It's these middle players of financial institutions, technology companies, energy companies who operate in the private sector, right?
Exactly. Yes, and that's critical to making sanctions effective, right? I mean, you need to craft sanctions in a way that they're understandable by banks and companies and they're implementable. If you craft something that a bank and or a company can't understand, either they're just not going to comply, or more often now you get what's called overcompliance, where they'll actually overshoot and do more than you want them to do. In certain circumstances, you may only want to cut off a certain range of economic activity. And this has been a problem that known as de-risking, where a handful of U.S. sanctions on a country sometimes can lead to the private sector broadly shunning that entire country if the restrictions aren't clear enough about what's allowed and what isn't.
Eddie, let's move on to our final question. The events and the decisions made by the characters in your book have fundamentally altered geopolitics moving forward. What are your thoughts on what the world economy will look like in the coming decades as nations strive to achieve their strategic goals?
Look, when I got to the end of writing Chokepoints, which, as I hope people will find if they read the book, it's a narrative history. So it really tells the story of how the age of economic warfare came about. But when I got to the end, I couldn't help but realize and acknowledge that there was this sort of secular trend cutting across the entire narrative, in which each administration in the United States in the 21st century has used sanctions more than their predecessor. In fact, there's this doubling phenomenon where every president in the 21st century has imposed sanctions at roughly double the rate of their predecessor. And so even for someone like me who, I love history and I think that individual decision-making matters, couldn't help but acknowledge that there is probably some sort of structural factor at work. And the way that I would kind of define that structural factor right now is that the global economy is still designed for the benign geopolitical environment of the 1990s, but we're living in an era of increasing geopolitical confrontation. And so what that means is that sanctions, export controls, tariffs, they're just going to keep on coming from the US, from Canada, from China, from other countries until we feel like we have regained some sense of economic security that maybe has been lost with the return of great power competition. So, in terms of what the global economy will look like in the coming years, I mean, I think there are really two big ways that it could evolve. One would be that economic interdependence recedes between the U.S. and China, but that the U.S. retains significant economic interdependence with countries that we traditionally view as allies, like Canada, like the European Union, Japan. This is a concept known as friendshoring, where the U.S. would tighten its supply chains with allies while decoupling from China. You basically wind up with a global economy of blocks, with a big block led by the U.S. and another block led by China. But I think there's also an alternative where, in the recent months, the Trump administration has been employing economic pressure not only against China and Russia and Iran, but also against traditional allies like Canada, like the EU, like Japan. And I think if that trend persists, what you'll get is a much more chaotic breakdown of the global economy, where every nation is for itself, and where, as a business in the United States, the only logical place to invest is at home, whether it's your supply chain, whether it's your personnel. You get something almost like autarky by default. And it's kind of unthinkable right now, given the base that we're starting from. But I think in a 10 to 20 year period, you could see a much more isolationist United States. And the thing I worry about there is you'll have slower economic growth, certainly here at home in the US. You'd have higher inflation. But I think the biggest concern of all is that what history shows is that when states can't acquire resources and markets through open trade, they're tempted into imperialism and conquest, into seizing territory. And so what I do worry about most is that while the age of economic warfare may not be the best possible world we could live in, the alternative might not be good either. You might have something that looks more like shooting wars coming back into favor.
Eddie, final 60 seconds. There's no going back, right? Like, we are not moving back to the point where we're not using I shouldn't say we, the American leaders are not using sanctions, are not using export controls. It's out of the bag and it's just going to increase, right?
I think that's right. I think there's no going back. And by the way, when we say we, like, I do think it definitely applies to the US, but I think it applies to other countries as well. And this phenomenon has not been isolated to the United States. You've seen Canada, you've seen the EU, you've seen China, you've seen Japan using sanctions, export controls, tariffs more and more and more over recent decades. In many ways, some of them are catching up much more quickly than you'd expect to the United States. I would bet if you looked at the data, that there's been an even greater increase in Canadian and European sanctions over the last 5 years than in US sanctions, because the US was at least starting from a relatively high base, whereas Canada and the EU were starting at very little and have quite rapidly ramped up. So no, I don't think there's any going back. And I think what the biggest challenge really for us today is defining what kind of end state we seek, what is the global economy that we're going toward, and then B, making sure that our policy is disciplined enough that we get there and that we don't move something into something like autarky in a backsliding and default fashion.
Eddie, that has been 5 questions. You've answered them in 5 minutes. Let's move on to our bonus questions. And you brought it up a little bit earlier about your background, but I want to know more about your history. How did you decide to work for the government and now be a professor and teacher at Columbia? What is your motivation for wanting to get into this line of work?
Yeah, look, my motivation, I was a college student in the years after 9/11, right? When the US is fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and when Iran's nuclear program comes to the fore of the US foreign policy agenda. And I was motivated to going into government to try to find an alternative to military force, to try to see if there was a way that we could end the nuclear threat from Iran with economic sanctions. And then I was motivated more to stay around when, we had an even bigger problem on our hands, which was Russian imperialism. And could we use economic warfare as a way to check Putin's designs to redraw borders in Europe at the point of a gun? So that's really what brought me into government. The reason I teach about it, the reason I write about it, the reason that motivated me to write Chokepoints in the first place is I left government thinking that being really amazed by how front and center economic warfare already was in the 2010s in U.S. foreign policy, but also a bit discouraged that there was so little knowledge of economic warfare, even at the heart of the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. And so teaching I see as my way to ideally train the next generation of public servants in the U.S. and other countries who can go work on these issues and hopefully craft policies more intelligent than the ones that we did when I was in government. And then in terms of writing Chokepoints, and the reason I wrote it as narrative nonfiction that's really accessible to a general audience, is I think it's incumbent upon democratic societies to understand these issues because they're affecting our everyday lives. They affect prices for goods. They affect economic growth. They affect our business decisions, and they affect the biggest questions of war and peace. And so I think it's essential for citizens and democratic societies to understand how economic warfare works so that we can vote and inform our governments accordingly.
Eddie, obviously the book is a major accomplishment, but can you tell us a little bit more about another achievement that you are proud of?
Oh, man. Well, look, today is my wedding anniversary, so
Congratulations.
I guess I'm proud of the family that my wife and I have created. We have two wonderful kids. In many ways, that's a bet that hopefully the future will be better than the past. And I'm proud of the fact that my wife and I, who also she was an official at the Treasury Department as well, that we're hopefully able to bring kids into this world, who can contribute to fostering a more peaceful and prosperous world.
Eddie, our last question for you. What are you excited about working on in the next 12 months? Anything on the horizon? Another book?
Man, I don't know, man. I think I need to sleep a little bit more before I write my next book. But I think, where I've sort of come out, and I spoke about this earlier in our conversation, I really think that one of the big things we're lacking right now in the West overall, in the US, Canada, Europe, we understand that the global economy as we knew it is coming apart, but I don't think we have a clear vision of what we want. We know that the status quo is not sustainable, but we haven't yet set out a vision for the future. So I think the next direction of my research is going to be looking at end states for the global economy. What would an idealized version of the global economy look like given the current era of geopolitical competition? And then kind of backing out from there to try to think through some policies that the US and other countries might be able to pursue to make it likelier that we end up there.
Eddie, thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. Again, the title of the book is Chokepoints. You should definitely read it. If you're not able to buy it, check it out from your local library. It is a necessary read because Eddie describes the history and the potential future of sanctions and American economic warfare. Eddie, thank you so much for joining us.
Pavan, thanks for having me on.
The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.